The bedtime stories of the Corthon Reach always ended the same way: a hull that was never built, a name that was never spoken aloud, a shape in the deep dark that arrived only when an empire grew too proud, did its work in silence, and left nothing behind to argue with. Mothers told it to frighten children into sleep. Admirals told it to frighten each other into caution. Nobody, in 9,000 years of careful Corthon records, had ever found a single bolt to prove that any part of it was real. Lore Master Issa Tale had spent her whole life proving it was not. She was a chronicler by trade, which in the old Corthon tongue meant something closer to a coroner of stories. Her work was to walk into a legend, open it up, and show the dull, ordinary bones underneath. She had killed the legend of the drowned sun by finding the cracked moon that made its impossible tides. She had killed the legend of the singing fleet by proving it was a malfunctioning relay choir, 3 jumps from where anyone had thought to look. She had built an entire respected career on one simple, comforting idea. Nothing in the dark was ever worse than the things people already knew. The monsters were always smaller than the fear of them. That was the whole of her faith, and she had never once been wrong. So when the High Sept summoned her to the capital and handed her the oldest legend of all, and told her, in a quiet room full of nervous officials, to finally put it in the ground, she thought it would take her a single season. The room they gave her the task in was the oldest debate hall in the Reach, a vaulted stone chamber where her people had argued over their fears for 4,000 years. There were 11 of the Sept present, more than she had ever seen gathered in one place, and they did not look like a council that wanted a story disproved. They looked like people who had been losing sleep. The eldest of them, a thin gray figure named Oren Vask, who had taught half the Reach's officers when they were young, leaned across the table toward her and asked her a strange question. He did not ask whether she could disprove the pale verdict. He asked whether she truly wanted to. Issa had not understood the question then. She understood it later, far too late. At the time she had answered the way she always answered, with the calm pride of a chronicler who had never met a story she could not open. She told the 11 of the Sept that a frightened people was a dangerous people, that hope built on a buried savior was the worst kind of hope because it stopped people from saving themselves, and that her whole purpose, the reason her trade existed at all, was to take the monsters out of the dark and lay them on the table where everyone could see they were only bone. She told them she would have the pale verdict laid bare and harmless within the season, written up plainly enough that no colonist would ever again stand on a rooftop watching the dark for a gray ship that was not coming. Oren Vask had looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone walking cheerfully toward a thing he cannot warn them away from. Then he had simply nodded, and thanked her, and told her the archive at Meldoran would give her everything the Reach had ever gathered. As she left the hall, he said one more thing, almost to himself, that she carried with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Some stories, Lore Master, we tell because they are false, and some we tell because they are true, and we pray they stay told." He did not explain which one he thought this was. She had assumed, with the easy certainty of the unafraid, that he was simply an old man frightened by a war, and she had gone to her work. The legend was called the Pale Verdict. In the stories, it was a warship the size of a grievance, gray as old bone, that did not chase and did not threaten and did not bargain. It simply appeared at the end of a war that had gone too far, and then the war was over, and then the verdict was gone, and the only living things left to speak of it were the ones who had been too small to matter. Issa had inherited a folder of 340 claimed sightings, gathered across 90 generations of frightened watchkeepers. She had personally disproven 309 of them. The other 31 were missing fleets, and missing fleets, she had learned across a long career, were almost always nothing more than bad navigation paired with worse pride. She was reading the 310th file, a sighting from a copper mining colony 4 centuries dead, when the Reach went to war with the Aubec cluster, and everything she believed began, very slowly, to come apart. The Aubec were not subtle. They were a loose coalition of 40 seeding worlds that had decided, after a bad harvest century and a long resentment, that the Corthon Reach had too much and they had too little, and that the cleanest fix was simply to take it. They came with numbers. That was their entire doctrine, the only one they had ever needed. Where the careful Reach built one good ship, the Aubeck built 9 rough ones, and they fed those rough ships into a battle the way a person feeds wood into a fire, knowing that some of it would not catch, and not caring in the least, because there was always more wood. In the first 8 months of the war, they took 10 Korthun systems. In the 9th month, they took 11 more. The arithmetic of it was relentless, and it did not slow down. Issa watched it from the archive station at Meldoran, a quiet moon of libraries on the safe side of the Reach where the war was still only a sound on the long-range feeds. She was not a soldier. She had never fired anything heavier than a survey charge in her life. But she was a Korthun, and she had a Korthun's deep stubbornness, and as the systems fell one after another, she found herself doing the only thing she truly knew how to do. She kept records. She wrote down the names of the dead worlds, in full, with their populations and their founding dates, and the small particular things that had made each of them itself, so that someone, someday, would be able to read them and know that they had been real. It was while she was doing exactly that, on the night the Aubeck announced over open channels that they would burn the capital system of Hesh to the bedrock, that the message reached her desk. It came in on a channel no one had used in 200 years. The archive flagged it first as corrupt, then as a hoax, then as something for which it had no category at all, which Issa had never once seen the system do. She almost deleted it on reflex. Her hand was already on the command. But the chronicler in her, the part that could not leave any story unopened, that had to know the dull truth even of a forgery, made her play it instead. There was no voice. There was a single line of old Korthun script, the kind carved on tombs and nowhere else, and a set of coordinates that pointed at nothing. Empty space. A gravity well around a star with no name and no planets. 11 jumps past the last Korthun border buoy, in a direction the survey map simply marked as not surveyed and never had. The line of tomb script said, "When the count of the enemy passes 100,000, wake what you buried." Issa read it 9 times. Then she laughed, alone in her quiet office, because it was the most obvious kind of hoax, the kind that played on a frightened population's oldest dream, the pale verdict, a buried savior sleeping in the deep, waiting to be woken when the numbers got bad enough. Somebody with a fine sense of theater had timed it perfectly, slipping the myth into the public feeds on the very night the capital was threatened, and she could already see, clear as a chart, the panic it would cause if it spread to the colonies. People reaching for a god in the dark instead of reaching for their evacuation transports. People standing on the rooftops to watch for a savior while the real ships fell. Legends got people killed. That, more than anything, was why she had spent her life killing them first. She wrote her debunking before she finished her cup of tea. She titled it plainly and without drama. She explained that the coordinates pointed at certified empty vacuum, that the channel was a forgery dressed in 200 years of false age, that the tomb script was a modern carving aged with cheap acid, and that the pale verdict was, as it had always been and would always be, a thing the Reach told itself so that it could sleep at night while its real ships did the real and ugly work of dying. Then, out of nothing more than long habit, because a good chronicler verifies even the things she is most certain of, she pointed the station's deep array at the empty coordinates to record the precise and documented nothing that was waiting there. The array took 4 hours to focus across that enormous distance. Issa went to sleep. She did not dream of warships. She dreamed of the names of the dead worlds, the way she often did now, the list of them growing longer in her sleep. When she woke and went to her desk with fresh tea, the screen was waiting for her, patient and cold, and the nothing was not nothing. There was a mass at the coordinates, cold, dark, and perfectly still, sitting in the gravity well of the nameless star, like a stone resting at the bottom of a deep pond. It gave off no power signature at all. It answered no hail. It had no running lights and no heat bleed and no transponder pulse, which was precisely why every passing survey for 200 years had read it as a stray rock and logged it as nothing and moved on without a second glance. But it was 4 kilometers long, and rocks 4 kilometers long do not have 900 sealed gun ports cut in perfect, patient rows down the length of both their flanks. Issa Tail sat in the cold blue light of her screen, the steam rising off her second forgotten cup of tea, and felt the one thing she had spent her entire life refusing to feel. She had opened a legend to show the world the dull bones underneath. She had been so certain there would be bones, ordinary and explainable, and small. The bones had turned out to be real, and they were enormous, and they were waiting. She did not tell the High Sept, not at first. A chronicler who cried savior on the strength of one cold scan would be a fool, and worse, a dangerous one, because a frightened people might believe her and stop running and start praying. Issa Tail had built her whole name on never being a fool, so she did what she always did, with a story that refused to lie down and die. She went to look at it herself, with her own instruments and her own eyes, the way the trade demanded. The archive station at Meldoran kept a single courier, a thin survey craft named the Patient Margin, built for crossing quiet distances slowly and recording them carefully. Issa requisitioned it on a chronicler's standing authority, loaded it with 6 weeks of supplies and every recording device the moon could spare, and pointed it out toward the nameless star 11 jumps past the border. She told the station administrator that she was chasing a forgery back to its source, to find the clever person who had carved the false tune script. That much at least was technically true. She had simply not yet decided which way the truth was going to turn when she got there, and she had learned long ago never to promise a conclusion before she had earned it. The jumps took her straight through the edges of the war, and the war was worse up close than any feed had made it look. From the margin's narrow ports, she watched 3 Corthan systems die. She watched the Aubec do it with their terrible, grinding patience. They did not maneuver. They did not feint. They surrounded each world with hundreds of rough hulls, formed a slow closing noose, absorbed whatever the desperate defenders could throw at them, lost ship after ship without flinching, and then simply continued, the way a tide continues regardless of how many waves break against the rocks. There was no cleverness in it to admire and no cruelty in it to hate. There was only the arithmetic, vast and indifferent, and the arithmetic always came out the same. By the time she reached the last Corthun border buoy she had counted, on the long passive feeds, more than 90,000 active Aubec ships in the theater. The doctrine of numbers was working exactly as designed. The Reach was running out of worlds far faster than it was running out of courage, and courage, Issa had bitterly learned, did not stop a thing that did not feel fear, and did not slow a thing that did not bleed. On the 7th jump, she stopped at a colony called Tan's Rest, a small mining world that had not yet fallen but knew it would, to take on water and to do the only other thing she knew how to do. She walked among the people who were waiting to die. They were loading what they could into transports too few and too slow, and they did not weep, because there was no time left for weeping, and an old foreman with mine dust ground permanently into the creases of his hands asked her what she was, a stranger arriving on no schedule in a courier with no fleet behind it. She told him she was a chronicler. He asked her, plainly, without bitterness, whether she had come to write down their names, and Issa Tail, who had written down the names of 22 dead worlds already, found that she could not lie to the man, and said yes. He nodded slowly, as if this were a reasonable thing for the universe to send him at the end, and then he said a thing she did not expect. He said, "My grandmother used to tell me that when the count got high enough, the gray one would wake." He said it the way a man says a thing he stopped believing decades ago, but has started, in his last days, to wish he could believe again. Issa had opened her mouth to do her duty, to tell him gently that the gray one was a story, that no one was coming, that the only ships in the dark were the ones his people were too few to crew. And she had stopped. She did not know why she stopped. Some part of her, the part that had seen a cold scan it could not explain, would not let her take the last comfort from a dying man on no better authority than her own pride. So she said nothing. She let him keep his grandmother's story. She finished taking on water and she left Tan's Rest still believing, and she thought about the foreman's hands for the rest of the journey, and she did not yet understand that she had just done, for the first time in her life, the very thing the dead had built the whole legend to make people do. The nameless star, when she finally crossed the last empty jumps and reached it, was the loneliest place she had ever seen in a lifetime of seeing lonely places. A small dim sun, barely more than a banked ember, hanging by itself in a part of the sky the maps had never bothered to fill in. It had no children. No planets, no asteroid belt, no comets, not even the cold dusty disk a star usually keeps. Just empty space, and one dark mass in its gravity well, exactly where the array had said it would be, growing on her screens from a single point to a shape, to a wall that filled her forward ports and kept on growing. It was the most frightening thing Issa had ever looked at, and the worst part of it, the part that made the small hairs rise along her arms, was that it was completely and perfectly silent. The Korthun built their warships to be seen. A warship was a statement of intent, all banner lights and proud hull glyphs and bright defiant heraldry, built to make an enemy reconsider before a single shot was fired. This thing in the dark was the exact opposite of a statement. It had been built to be a whole. Its hull was a gray so flat and so total that it seemed to drink her floodlights and give nothing back, so that even with every lamp the margin had blazing, she could only see the parts of it the light happened to strike, and never the whole. There were no markings on it she could read, no flags, no crests, no proud heraldry. There was only a single line of carved script along the prow, in a font so old her translator strained and stuttered against it, and beneath the script, a long serial designation written in a numbering system the Korthun had never in their entire recorded history used. The carved word said one thing. The closest her straining translator could manage was a word that meant both verdict and last word at once. The thing said, "When there is nothing left to be said, and only the saying remains." The serial beneath it she copied down exactly, character by careful character, because she did not recognize the language it was written in, and the oldest rule of her trade was that a chronicler records faithfully even the things she does not understand. She flew the margin the entire length of the hull, all 4 kilometers of cold flat gray, recording every meter of it. The 900 gun ports were sealed, each one a perfect oval seam in the metal, and she could not begin to guess what kind of weapon waited behind each of them. There were docking collars set into the underside, dozens of them, every one sized for craft far larger than her own little courier. And there were scars on the hull, old ones, long deep furrows gouged into the gray, and they had been there so long that the metal around them had healed into a different shade, gone a paler gray with the slow patience of centuries, and Issa felt a cold, slow understanding settle into her chest. This ship had fought before. A very long time ago, something had reached out and torn those furrows into 4 kilometers of war metal, and whatever it had not been enough, because the thing it had clawed was still here, sleeping, waiting, perfectly intact behind its ancient wounds. She found the open collar on her 3rd slow pass down the hull. It was the only breach in the whole silent shape, a single docking port standing open to the dark, its interior unlit, as though it had been left that way deliberately, as though it had been left open for a very long time, for someone, and that someone had simply never come. Every instinct of self-preservation, Issa had told her to turn the margin around and run home across the 11 jumps and never speak a word of this place to anyone living. But she was a chronicler, and a chronicler does not stand at the open door of the oldest legend in her people's memory, the legend she has spent her whole life disproving, and choose, at the very threshold, not to go in. She docked. The collar received her courier with a soft mechanical certainty, mechanisms moving smoothly that had not moved in 9,000 years. She suited up with hands that were almost steady. She stepped aboard the pale verdict, and the legend let her in. Inside, the cold was the first thing. Not the empty cold of a dead ship, which is only the cold of vacuum, the cold of nothing at all. This was a deliberate cold, the low even chill of a thing kept deliberately under, maintained across the long centuries, a held breath made into a temperature. The second thing she felt was the scale. The corridors were tall, far taller than any Korthun would ever need, and wide enough for machines she could not picture, and they ran away from her lamp into a darkness that swallowed the light long before it found any wall. The third thing, and the thing that would stay with her the longest, longer than the cold and longer than the scale, was the silence. The verdict made no sound at all, not a hum, not a tick, not the small, endless settling noises that any structure in the universe makes as it sits. It was as silent as the carved word on its prow. It was as silent as a held last word. She walked for a full hour through that silence and saw no body, no remains, no slightest sign that anyone had ever lived or died here. The ship was clean, not maintained in any ordinary sense, but clean the way a sealed tomb is clean, dry and untouched and waiting, the dust of 9,000 years somehow never having found a way in. She passed sealed hatches, each one with that same alien serial scheme stenciled neatly beside it. She passed a chamber the size of a cathedral, filled with empty cradles built to hold craft that were no longer there and had not been there for a very long time. She passed what she only slowly understood was a hospital, ranked with row upon row of empty berths, and the understanding turned her stomach over, because a warship built with a hospital that vast had been built by people who expected there to be survivors to heal, which meant its makers had planned for a thing terrible enough to leave survivors needing healing, which meant the oldest part of the stories, the part about the small ones who were spared, was true as well. It was in the deepest part of the ship, past one final hatch that opened for her smoothly, without being asked, that she found the heart of it. She stood at the threshold of the round room for a long time before she went in, which was not like her. A chronicler crosses thresholds. It was the whole of the trade, the willingness to step through the door of a story and see what was on the other side. But there had been something in the air of that final corridor, a weight, a sense of being expected, that had made her hesitate the way she had not hesitated since she was very young. She had told herself it was only the cold. She had told herself it was only the silence, which by then had gone on so long that her own breathing inside the helmet sounded loud and rude. She knew, even as she told herself these things, that they were not true, and that the real reason she hesitated was that some animal part of her, older than her training and older than her pride, had understood before the rest of her did that whatever waited in that round room was awake and patient and had been waiting a very long time and was waiting now, specifically, for her. The chamber beyond was round, vast, and ringed all the way around with dark dead consoles. In its exact center rose a column of clouded crystal, taller than 3 Korthuns standing one atop another, and inside the clouded crystal, something turned, slowly. A knot of light, the dull deep blue of a star seen through fathoms of cold water. It was not a reactor. Issa had seen 100 reactors. This was something far older and far simpler and far worse than a reactor. It was a sleeping thing, and as she stepped across the threshold into the round room, it began, very slightly, very certainly, to wake. A voice came out of the cold, dead air. It spoke Old Korthun, the tomb-carving kind, the very script that had been on the prow and in the message that had drawn her 11 jumps across the dark to this room. It was a calm voice, neither male nor female, neither plainly living nor plainly machine, the voice of something that had decided, a very long time ago, exactly what it was, and exactly what it was for, and had never once since wavered. It said, "You have come because the count has passed 100,000. Issa could not make herself speak. The voice did not appear to need her to. "It is permitted to be afraid," the voice said, into her silence. "The ones who made me were afraid when they made me. They were the very last of a people who had been very proud for a very long time, and their pride had finally bought them a war they could not win by being proud, so they stopped being proud. It is the hardest thing a proud people can ever do, and they did it, at the end, when there was nothing else left to try. They poured everything they had left into one hull, and one purpose, and one single promise, and then they hid that hull where no proud enemy would ever think to look for it, in an empty place, around a star with no name and no children. And they left it sleeping here, in the cold, with one instruction, to be carried out only when an empire's enemies had grown past a certain count. Do you know what that one instruction was? Issa shook her head inside her helmet, though she did not know whether the thing in the crystal could see her do it. The instruction, said the voice, was simple. End the war. Not win it. End it. There is a difference between those two things, chronicler, and the difference is the whole of what I am and the whole of why I exist. A people who only want to win will fight forever. They will trade world for world, and fleet for fleet, and feed wood to the fire until there is no more wood, and no more fire, and no more people, and they will call it honor right up until the last of them goes out. The ones who made me were long past wanting to win. They had wanted to win, once, and it had cost them everything. At the end, all they wanted was for the fire to be out. So they built a thing that does not fight wars. They built a thing that finishes them. The blue knot in the crystal turned a little faster. Far away through the silent hull, Issa felt rather than heard a deep change, a slow stirring in the gray metal, as though the whole 4 kilometers of the ship had just drawn its first full breath in 9,000 years, and was beginning, gently, to remember what it was. You are not of the people who made me, the voice said. Your blood is younger than theirs by ages they could not have counted, but you are of the reach that grew up in the place where they died, and you carry their stubbornness in you whether you know it or not, and you came when you were called, across 11 jumps, into the dark, alone, with no weapon but a lamp. That is enough. The promise was never made to a bloodline. Bloodlines end. The promise was made to anyone who would still be standing at the end of a war too far gone, and who would still, in spite of everything, want the fire out. Tell me, chronicler, the ones who are burning your worlds, how many of them are there? Issa found her voice at last. It came out small and thin in the great cold round room, swallowed almost at once by the dark. 90,000, she said. Maybe more by now. They have taken 22 of our systems. They are going to burn the capital. They have already said they will. There was a silence then, in the round room, and Issa understood somehow that it was not hesitation. It was the silence of something doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic it was doing had nothing at all to do with whether it could win. Then the count will pass 100,000 before they are finished, the voice said at last. With the carriers and the haulers and the gun barges and the reserve, it will pass it easily. The condition is met. The promise comes due. Sit, chronicler. You came across 11 jumps and into a tomb because you needed to know whether the oldest legend of your people was true or false. You are about to learn that it was never either. You are going to ride inside the answer, and you are going to write down what you see, because someone always has to, and you are the one who came. Before the consoles woke, Issa asked the one question a chronicler always asks, the question that was the whole of her trade, the question she had asked of 309 debunked sightings and had never once been afraid of the answer to. She asked the voice who its makers had been. She asked for their name so that she could write it down, because a thing without a name was only a rumor, and a thing with a name was history. The voice was quiet for a moment, and when it answered, there was something in it Issa had not heard before, something that might have been grief, if a thing 9,000 years old could still hold grief that long. You will not find their name in any of your records, it said, because they made certain of that, at the end. They erased themselves more carefully than they hid me. A name can be hunted. A name can be hated. A name gives a proud enemy a thing to swear vengeance against across the generations, and vengeance was the very thing they built me to end. So they took their own name out of the dark before they slept. They became the thing in the story with no name, around the star with no name, and that namelessness is not an accident or a sadness, chronicler. It is a weapon, the same as the doubt, the same as the silence. They learned, at the cost of everything they had, that the surest way to be safe from the proud is to be a thing the proud cannot point at. I will tell you what they were instead of who. They were a people who had been the strongest thing in their region of the dark for 2,000 years, and who had believed, because they were strongest, that strength was the same as safety. They learned, in one war, that it was not. They learned it the way your AudioBook are about to learn it, and they decided, with the last of themselves, that no one would ever have to learn it from them again. That is the only name they left me to give you. The ones who learned. Write that down, if you must write something. And Issa, who had come 11 jumps to put a name to a legend, found that she had been given instead the deliberate absence of one, and that the absence told her more than any name could have. She wrote it down exactly as the voice gave it. The ones who learned. It was the only honest entry in the file she would ever make. Every dead console in the round chamber woke at once, in a single silent wave, and the dark hull all around her filled, slowly, deliberately, without any hurry at all, with a light the exact color of a verdict being read aloud in a courtroom where the sentence has already been decided. The pale verdict did not roar to life. That was the thing Issa would remember most clearly, later, when she sat at her desk and tried to put it into a record that no one would ever believe. There was no surge, no rising whine of great engines straining toward power, no shudder of a sleeping giant hauling itself upright. The ship simply stopped being asleep, the way a predator stops being still, between one moment and the next, and the change was so total, and so quiet, and so complete, that her gloved hands closed white-knuckled on the cold console rail and would not let go. The voice gave her a seat. A cradle rose smoothly out of the floor beside the crystal column, shaped for a body larger than hers, but holding her well enough when she sank into it. And she sank into it because her legs had quietly stopped agreeing to hold her up. Screens unfolded out of the cold air all around her, layer upon layer of them, and on those screens she saw the ship the way the ship saw itself. 900 gun ports, their long-sealed seams retracting one patient row at a time, with no sound she could hear, each one opening into a long dark throat of strange metal now bared to the empty stars. Dozens of docking cradles, all of them empty, their old occupants 9,000 years gone to dust, but the ship did not reach for them and did not seem to miss them. It had been built, in the end, to do this alone. The makers had known they would not be there. They had built a thing that needed no one. How? Issa asked. Her voice still shook. How do you cross 11 jumps to reach them? My courier took 6 weeks, running flat out. I do not cross distance the way your couriers cross it, the voice said. The ones who made me did not have the luxury of time and did not build me to spend it. Distance was the enemy's friend, never theirs. Watch. The nameless star fell away. It did not shrink in the windows the way a star shrinks when a ship pulls slowly away from it across the long hours. It simply was there, dim and lonely and close, and then it was a memory, a thing that had happened, and the verdict was somewhere else entirely, hanging silent in the dark at the very edge of the Hesh capital system, where more than 90,000 Albeck ships were drawn up in a vast, slow noose around the brightest and oldest world the Korthun had ever built. The crossing of 11 jumps had taken less time than it took Issa Tail to draw a single startled breath, and she understood, sitting frozen in that cradle, that she had spent her entire life debunking a thing that had never once been lying to her. The stories had not been false. They had only failed, every single one of them, to be frightening enough. On the screens, the Albeck Armada filled the dark like grain spilled across a black floor. 91,406 hulls, the verdict counted them aloud, in the dry, flat tone of a clerk reading off the lines of an inventory. Not warships, most of them, the voice noted, in the same dry tone, as if cataloging stock. Carriers full of soldiers, haulers heavy with fuel and ground armor, rough gun barges, each one a freighter's spine with a single oversized weapon bolted along it. The doctrine of numbers, made flesh, 90,000 times over, each ship a single piece of wood meant for the fire, and behind all of them, on the bright curve of the world called Hesh, the capital's lights still burned, all the way down to the smallest coastal town. The Albeck had been hours, perhaps less, from putting every one of those lights out forever. They saw the verdict arrive. Of course they saw it. A 4-kilometer hole in the dark does not go unnoticed even by an enemy who does not understand the first thing about what it is looking at. Issa watched the vast formation ripple as 10,000 sensor returns swung at once toward the silent newcomer at the system's edge, and she watched, On a channel the verdict patched directly into her cradle, the exact moment the AudioBook command decided what she was. They decided she was nothing. The AudioBook did not have the Korthon legends. They had never once lain awake as children to a story about a gray ship and a verdict in the dark. They had no folder of 340 sightings, no 31 missing fleets, no 9,000 years of careful, frightened watchkeeping. To them, the verdict was simply one old hull where they had 90,000, a single dark shape with no banners and no power signature worth reading, and their commander, a being whose words the verdict translated for Issa in that same dry, patient voice, laughed at it. He told his fleet, on an open channel, that the desperate Korthon had sent a derelict to frighten them at the 11th hour. He told them it was a museum piece, a hollow bluff, a last theatrical act of pride from a proud people about to lose their capital and knowing it. And then he ordered 400 gun barges to break formation and go and destroy it, not because 400 were needed against one, but because 400 would be a fine joke, a way to show the watching fleet exactly how little the Korthon god in the dark was worth. The 400 came. Issa watched them grow on the screens, a loose swarm of rough hulls trailing the smeared fire of cheap engines, every one of them firing as it came in. The whole swarm lit up with the flash of their guns, and she braced herself hard in the cradle for the ship to shudder under the storm of impacts she could see racing toward it. The ship did not shudder. The fire reached the verdict's flanks, and it stopped, not against any shield she could see. No shimmering dome, no flaring barrier, but against the simple and final fact of the hull itself, those old flat gray flanks that had taken deep furrows from something 9,000 years ago, and were still here, intact, to talk about it. The AudioBook shells burst against the gray and scattered and left nothing behind, not a scorch, not a dent, not a mark. The verdict did not so much as alter its course. It hung there at the edge of the system and let 400 ships throw everything they had, and it was as if the 400 had never fired at all. Then it opened its 900 throats, all at once, and it answered, and Issa Tale finally learned exactly what the carved word on the prow had always meant. It was nothing like the war on the feeds. The war on the feeds had been a thing of trades, this fleet against that fleet, losses tallied on both sides, the slow grinding arithmetic of attrition where everyone paid and the bigger purse won. The verdict did not do arithmetic. It did not trade. From each of its 900 open ports came a single lance of pale light, not bright, not loud, a dull gray-white, the exact color of the hull that fired it, and where each lance touched an AudioBook ship, the ship was simply not there anymore. There was no explosion. There was no spreading fire, no tumbling debris, no slow blossom of destruction. The hull was, and then it was unmade, reduced in an instant to a fading smear of cooling dust, as though the verdict had reached out across the dark and quietly erased a line that someone had drawn in error and should never have drawn at all. 400 gun barges came apart in 11 seconds. Issa counted them. She would always count them, for the rest of her life. 11 seconds, from the first lance to the last, and the fine joke the AudioBook commander had ordered was a slowly spreading field of drifting dust, and the laughter on the open channel stopped all at once, completely, the way a crowded room goes silent when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that the joke was always on them. The verdict had not moved from the spot where it arrived. The commander did not believe it, even then. That was the thing about the doctrine of numbers, the voice explained quietly to Issa, as the dust of the 400 drifted apart on the screens. It did not break because it lost ships. It had been built to lose ships. Losing 400 out of 90,000 was, to a mind that thought in wood and fire, not a defeat at all but a rounding error, a price already budgeted for. So the commander did the thing his doctrine told him to do. He stopped laughing, and he stopped joking, and he reached for the one part of his fleet he had been holding in reserve precisely for an enemy that would not break to ordinary fire. Issa watched 11 shapes rise out of the deep formation, slow and enormous, far larger than the gun barges, each one a long spar of dark metal trailing a haze of its own coolant. The verdict named them for her without being asked. Siege lances, the voice said, the heaviest thing the AudioBook own. Each one carries a single weapon, a beam meant to crack open a fortified world's shield from orbit and hold it open long enough for the landing fleet to pour through. They are not meant to be fired at ships. They are meant to be fired at planets. He is going to fire 11 of them at me, all at once, because in his whole doctrine there is nothing larger left to reach for, and a mind that thinks in numbers always believes that the next, larger number will be the one that works. The 11 siege lances aligned themselves on the verdict with a slow, ponderous certainty, and they fired together. Issa had braced for the 400. She had not braced for this. 11 beams of furious white light, each one wide enough to swallow her whole courier 100 times over, each one carrying enough force to split a continent, converged on the single gray hull at once, and for the length of a held breath, the screens went white, and Issa was certain, for that one breath, that she had finally watched the legend die. The white faded. The verdict was still there. It had not moved. It had not shielded. The 11 world-cracking beams had struck those old flat gray flanks, the flanks that wore the furrows of something 9,000 years dead, and they had simply stopped, the way the 400 had stopped, the way everything stopped, against a hull that had been designed by a people who had already met something worse than anything the AudioBook would ever build. There was no scorch where the beams had struck. There was no glow of cooling metal. There was nothing at all, as if the 11 siege lances had fired into a hole in the universe, and the hole had quietly closed over the light and kept it. And then, almost gently, the verdict turned 11 of its 900 throats toward the 11 siege lances, one for each, and the heaviest weapons the AudioBook had ever built became 11 fading smears of dust, gone as quietly as the rest, and the commander on the open channel made a sound Issa had never heard a living thing make, the sound of a mind reaching the bottom of its doctrine and finding that there was nothing under it. You see, the voice said to Issa, quietly, and there was no boast in it at all. It was teaching. It had the patient tone of something explaining a thing it had explained 11 times before across 9,000 years. A people who only want to win would now press this advantage. They would chase the survivors. They would maneuver for position. They would turn this into a battle, and battles can be lost, and even when they are won they take worlds and lives and years with them, and they leave both sides nursing reasons to do it all again. I am not going to give them a battle. I have never given anyone a battle. I am going to give them a verdict. There is a difference between those two things, and you are about to watch it with your own eyes. Watch closely, chronicler. This is the part the stories never get right, because the small ones who survive to tell them are too frightened, by the end, to understand what they saw. On the screens, the AudioBook Armada was no longer laughing and no longer mocking. It was reacting. 90,000 hulls swinging at once into a vast defensive sphere, every weapon they possessed turning inward toward the single gray ship, now sitting silent at the heart of the noose they had built for a world. The commander's voice on the open channel was different now. The humor was gone out of it entirely, stripped away, and what was left was the flat, clipped speed of someone giving orders he no longer believed would work. He had stopped thinking of the verdict as a derelict. He had begun, far too late, ages too late, to be afraid. And Issa watched the fear spread through the Armada exactly the way the legends had always said it spread, the way she had always dismissed as a poet's flourish, a storyteller's convenient lie. It moved from the front ranks to the back, ship by ship, formation by formation, a visible ripple of course changes and panicked transmissions, until 90,000 crews who had spent 9 months of this war, utterly certain of their numbers, understood, all of them, in the same handful of seconds, that the numbers had never been the thing that mattered. They had built their entire doctrine, their entire war, their entire reason for crossing into the Reach, on the simple faith that you could feed enough wood to any fire to smother it. And the fire had just looked up at them. The verdict began to move, slowly, without the slightest hurry, into the exact center of the noose that had been built to choke a world. The gray ship advanced, opening its 900 throats again as it came, and the dark all around the bright burning capital of Hesh began to fill with a light the color of the last word. The word that is said when there is nothing left to say. The word carved on the prow, in a language 9,000 years dead, that meant both verdict and last word at once, and had always, Issa finally understood, meant both at the same time on purpose. "End the war," the voice said softly into her ear, as the lances reached out into the sphere, and the Armada began, ship by ship by ship, to come apart. Not win it, end it. Now, chronicler, now you are going to see, with your own eyes, exactly why those two things were never the same. Issa Tale had written the deaths of 22 worlds into her records, one careful name at a time, sitting alone at her desk on a quiet moon, while the feeds counted the dead. She had thought that was the worst thing a chronicler could ever be asked to do, the slow, careful witnessing of a long defeat. She learned, over the next 4 minutes, that she had been wrong about that, the way she had been wrong about so much. There was a thing worse than recording a slow defeat. It was recording a swift and total and absolutely calm reckoning, and finding, deep in herself, that no part of her was sorry it was happening. The verdict went through the AudioBook Armada the way a careful reader's eye goes down a page. It did not skip, and it did not linger. It started at one edge of the great defensive sphere, and it simply continued, at the same unhurried pace, and behind it, the sphere stopped existing in a widening, growing arc of cooling dust. The AudioBook poured everything they had into the gray hull as it came. 40,000 weapons fired on it at once, in a single coordinated wall of light that should by every law Issa knew have unmade any ship that had ever been built by any hand, and it broke against the verdict's old flat flanks and left no mark at all, because the thing that had carved those ancient furrows into the hull 9,000 years ago had been worse, far worse, than 40,000 gun barges firing together, and the verdict had outlived that too, and gone home, and slept, and waited for exactly this. Issa stopped trying to count the individual ships. There were too many of them, and they died too fast and too quietly, and the counting became a kind of madness. She counted by formations instead, the way an admiral would, the way her records would need it written. The AudioBook sixth column, 11,000 hulls strong, gone in under a minute, erased from the dark like a smudge wiped off glass. The reserve carriers, 4,000 of them, heavy with ground soldiers who had been promised an easy and glorious conquest of a soft and wealthy world, gone before most of them could even turn their bows toward the jump lanes and run. The command tier, last of all, the proud bright ring of capital ships from which the laughing commander had ordered 400 barges out to make a joke not 5 minutes before, gone at the end, and Issa heard his voice on the open channel right up to the final second. It did not beg, the AudioBook did not beg even then. It was not in them, and Issa found she respected that, in a cold, distant way she would think about for years. But the voice changed in those last seconds, the way the whole Armada had changed, from the voice of a being who believed in numbers to the voice of a being who had just, far too late, learned that there was a thing in the universe the numbers could not buy and the wood could not smother. That, Issa thought, watching the last capital ship come apart into cooling dust, was its own kind of verdict. To die in the exact moment you finally understood precisely why you were dying. The verdict gave that to them. It gave everyone that. It was, perhaps, the only mercy it knew how to give the proud. Once, in the middle of it, the AudioBook tried the only clever thing they would manage in the whole 4 minutes. A wing of their fastest gun barges broke away from the dying sphere and ran not at the verdict but past it, hard for the bright curve of Hesh itself, 300 of them in a desperate wedge, meaning to do to the capital in their last minutes what they had crossed the border to do, so that even in losing, they would take the world with them. It was the move of a doctrine that had only ever known how to trade. If they could not win, they would at least make the count even. The verdict did not turn to chase them. It did not need to. Issa watched on the screens as the gray ship simply opened a single additional row of throats along its upper flank, the row that faced the planet, and reached past itself across the whole width of the battle to touch the running wedge. 300 barges became 300 fading smears between one breath and the next, close enough to Hesh that the people on the night side of the capital would have seen 300 soft gray flashes high in their sky and never known how near the end had come, or how completely a thing they could not see had refused to let it arrive. Not one barge reached the atmosphere. Not one shell fell on a single roof. The verdict had been built by a people who had learned, at the cost of everything, that ending a war meant the war had to end for the small and the unarmed too, the ones on the ground who had never asked for it, and it spent exactly as much of itself protecting a city that did not know its name as it spent unmaking the fleet that had come to burn it. She made herself watch all of it, every second, to the last fading smear. A chronicler records what she does not want to see. That was the oldest and heaviest rule of her trade, the first one taught and the hardest one kept, and she had never once in a long career truly understood how heavy it was until this. She watched 90,000 ships become nothing, and she did not look away, because someone had to carry it home, and she was the one who had come. When it was done, the dark all around the world of Hesh was empty. Not empty of the AudioBook entirely. That was the part the legends had always gotten right, and never once explained, and Issa understood it now, from the inside, riding within the answer. The verdict had not killed everyone. Scattered through the slowly spreading wreckage were ships it had passed over and left untouched. Hundreds of them, all the small ones, the medical haulers, the unarmed supply tenders, the little courier craft and the message runners and the rear-rank cargo ships that had been too far back, too slow, too small, to have ever fired a single shot in the 4 minutes it had taken. The voice had told her, at the very beginning, in the cold round room, that the only survivors of the old stories were always the ones too small to matter. She had taken it for a poet's flourish, a sad, pretty line. It was not a flourish, it was doctrine, deliberate and exact. The verdict had been built to end a war, and a war does not truly end if you leave behind a wound large enough to fester and small enough to be ignored. So it had unmade the Armada down to the very last hull capable of carrying pride, and it had left alive, on purpose, with perfect care, every single hull that could only carry a survivor home. Issa watched the survivors begin to move. The hundreds of small, undamaged hulls the verdict had spared hung motionless for a long moment in the spreading dust, as if they could not quite believe they were still there to hang at all, and then, one by one, they turned and began the long, slow run for the jump lanes and home. The verdict did not stop them. It did not so much as track them. It let them go the way a thing lets go of what it has no use for, and Issa understood that this too was deliberate, that the running was part of the verdict, that every one of those small crews would carry the 4 minutes back across the border burned into them, and that the burning would do more to end the war than any number of dead ever could. She thought of the laughing commander, gone now to dust with his command tier, and she found she could not hate him, and the not hating frightened her more than anything else she had felt that day. He had been a fool, certainly. He had been cruel, in the lazy way that people who think in numbers are always cruel, treating 90,000 crews and 22 worlds as wood for a fire. But he had not been a monster, not really, not in the way the dark was supposed to make monsters. He had simply believed the thing that everyone strong always believes, the thing the makers of the verdict had believed 2,000 years before they learned better. He had believed that being the larger number was the same as being safe. He had died learning it was not. In the same instant Issa watched him learn it, and she carried that instant out of the battle with her and never put it down. The voice seemed to know what she was thinking. It often did. He was not special, it said. That is the hardest thing to understand and the most important. There was nothing uniquely wicked in him, nothing that marked him out from the 1,000 commanders who came before, across 9,000 years, and the 1,000 who will come after. He was only proud, and pride is not rare. Pride is the most common thing in the universe. That is why I exist, not to punish a wickedness, which would be simple and would end, but to interrupt a habit, which is endless. The proud will always rise. The numbers will always gather. Someone will always decide that the larger fleet is the safer one. And so, every few centuries, someone has to be there in the dark to remind them, calmly and completely, that it was never true. I am that reminder. I am not justice, chronicler. Justice is for things that happen once. I am a correction, for a thing that happens forever. Why? Issa asked, into the quiet. The round room was silent again, the screens around her showing only drifting dust and the unbroken burning lights of a capital that had not, after all, gone dark. Why leave any of them at all? You could have finished it. You could have left no one. Because a verdict is not a slaughter, the voice said. A slaughter teaches the survivors to hate, and to gather, and to come back. A verdict teaches them to stop. The ones I have left will go home across their own border. They will carry what they saw. And because they were the smallest of the fleet, the ones with no power, and no rank, and no pride to protect, they will be believed in a way no proud surviving captain would ever be believed. A proud officer who fled would invent a great battle to excuse his flight, and the story would sound like a battle that might be won next time. But a frightened medical orderly who watched 90,000 ships become dust in 4 minutes from the safety of a hauler the gray ship chose not to touch will tell the truth, the flat, impossible truth, and the truth has no next time in it. The AudioBook doctrine was numbers. I have just shown 40 seeding worlds that numbers are only wood, and that somewhere out in the dark there is a fire that does not care in the slightest how much wood you feed it. They will not come back to the reach. Not in your lifetime, not in your children's lifetimes, perhaps not ever. That, chronicler, is how you end a war. Not by killing everyone in it, by making the killing so complete, and so calm, and so total, that no story they can ever tell about it will sound, to anyone, like a reason to try again. Issa sat in the cradle and thought, slowly, about the 340 sightings in her folder back on the moon. The 31 missing fleets she had never been able to explain, and she understood now, all at once, that they had not been bad navigation. They had not been pride in poor charts. They had been verdicts, every single one of them, scattered across 9,000 years of history, each one an empire somewhere that had grown too proud and passed some count, and woken something it should have been wiser to leave sleeping. And every time, the verdict had finished its terrible calm work and gone back to its nameless star to sleep again, and the only ones ever left to tell the tale had been the small and the doubted, the orderlies and the cargo crews, so that the story always stayed a story, a thing mothers told to frighten children, a thing chroniclers like her built entire careers on disproving. The legend had survived, she finally realized, for 9,000 years, precisely because it kept doing exactly this. It was not a story that happened to hide a truth inside it. It was a truth that had chosen, deliberately, to wear a story like camouflage. As long as every living soul agreed that the pale verdict was a myth, no proud empire would ever truly believe it was coming for them, until it was already there in the dark, at the edge of their fleet. And a thing that no one believes in cannot be prepared for, and a thing that cannot be prepared for ends wars in 11 seconds and 4 minutes, and then quietly goes home to wait. You are going to let me tell it, Issa said slowly, the understanding arriving as she spoke it. The real one, the true one. That is why you let me aboard. That is why you let me watch all of it. You are going to send me home, and you are going to let me write it down. I am, the voice said. Then it will stop being a myth, Issa said. People will know. The next proud empire will believe it, and they will prepare for it, and they will hunt for the nameless star, and one day they will find you sleeping in the cold around it, and they will not let you wake. There was a long pause in the round room, and Issa had the strange and certain sense that the thing turning in the crystal was, for the first time since she had come aboard, almost amused. Chronicler, the voice said, you have spent your entire life proving that this ship was not real. You found a cold scan and you came. You found a silent hull and you boarded it. You found a voice in an empty room and you sat down to listen. You have watched me, with your own eyes, end an armada of 90,000 ships in 4 minutes. And even now, this very moment, sitting inside the heart of me, some quiet part of your mind is already composing the careful words you will use to make all of this sound impossible. You cannot help it. It is the truest thing about you. It is what you are. So tell me, When you go home across the 11 jumps and write the truest record you have ever written in your long, careful life, the most honest thing your hand has ever set down, do you know what your own people are going to do with it? Issa did not answer. She already knew. She had spent 30 years being the people who would do it. They will read it, the voice said gently, and they will admire your imagination, and they will file it lovingly beside the other 340 sightings as the single finest piece of myth making the Korthun Reach ever produced. And here is the last gift the ones who made me built into the legend, chronicler, the deepest part of the design. The truer you make it, the less they will believe you. The more honest your account, the more impossible it will sound, and the more certainly they will set it among the stories. It defends itself, not with the 900 guns. With doubt. You may tell the whole truth, as loudly and as plainly as you like, from every rooftop in the Reach, and it will only ever make the camouflage stronger and the sleep safer. That is the weapon the dead left behind, that outlasts even me. Doubt. They wove it into 9,000 years of bedtime stories, and it has never once failed. And Issa Tale, lore master of the Korthun Reach, sat in the cold turning heart of the realest thing she had ever touched in her life, and began, helplessly, to understand that every word the voice had spoken was true, and that there was nothing she could ever do about it but exactly what it had already foreseen. The pale verdict carried her home itself. It would not let her take the courier back. The patient margin, the voice explained, in the same patient teaching tone it used for everything, had a transponder, and a record of every jump it had made, and a fuel log that any careful analyst could one day read, and any single one of those three things might, in 100 years or 1,000, let some clever and determined enemy draw a line on a chart back to the nameless star. So the verdict swallowed the little survey craft whole into one of its dozens of empty cradles, the way it had once been built to swallow far larger ships, and it carried Issa across the 11 jumps in the time it took her to eat one cold ration meal in the round room, and it set her down at the lonely edge of the Meldoran system, in the deep dark beyond the outermost buoy, where the archive station's sensors would read her arrival as nothing more than a single small craft drifting in at the end of a long, quiet survey. Before it released her back into the dark, it spoke to her one final time. "You will want to come back," the voice said. "They always do. The ones who ride inside the answer. There have not been many of you across 9,000 years, but you have all been the same in this one thing. You will want to find me again. You will want to be sure, in your old age, that I was truly real. You will want to touch the cold gray hull a second time, with your own hand, so that the memory cannot ever be argued away from you, not even by yourself, not even on the nights when your own debunking instinct wakes you and whispers that you dreamed it. Do not come back. The nameless star is not a place for the living to visit twice. I have told you the whole truth, and I have let you watch the whole truth happen, and that is the entire measure of what you are owed, and more than any of the others got. The rest of your life is yours, chronicler, all of it. Do not spend it out here in the cold with me. Spend it on the living. They are the only thing any of this was ever for." Issa asked the only question she had left, the one a chronicler always asks at the very end of a legend, the question that is never really about the legend at all, but always, secretly, about herself. "How long," she said, "how long until the count passes 100,000 again? How long until you have to wake?" "I do not measure time the way you do," the voice said. "I have woken 11 times in 9,000 years, 11 empires, 11 counts. I will wake a 12th time when another empire forgets the difference between winning a war and ending one, which an empire always does, eventually, because it is the very easiest thing in the whole universe to forget. It is easier than breathing. It may come in your grandchildren's time. It may come 100 grandchildren from now, when your name and your reach and your whole language are themselves only stories. The count does not care who is proud, or when, or why. The count only counts. Go home, chronicler, write your record, and when you have written it, do one last thing for me, as a kindness, the only thing I will ever ask of you. Do not believe it too hard. Do not try too earnestly to make them believe it. The doubt is the armor. It has kept me alive and asleep for 9,000 years, and it has ended 11 wars, and it has saved more lives than you could write the names of in 10 lifetimes. Help me keep it on." Then the cradle opened beneath her, and the margin fell free into the dark, and when Issa turned the courier's ports back toward the place where the verdict had been, there was nothing there at all. No fading drive trail, no cooling wake, no hole punched in the stars. The gray ship had already gone back to being a story, and it had taken every shred of its evidence with it, every meter of recordable proof, and the only thing it left behind in the entire universe was one living chronicler who now knew, with perfect certainty, that no one would ever believe a word she said about it. She flew the rest of the long way in alone, and she had a great deal of time to think. On the return, she stopped once more at Tan's Rest, because it was on the way and because she had to know. She had half expected to find it ash. Instead, she found it breathing. The Aubeck siege ships that had been gathering at its edge were gone, withdrawn in the Great Retreat, and the transports the colony had been loading in despair were being quietly unloaded again, the people carrying their lives back into their homes, with the stunned, careful movements of those who had not expected to need their homes again. She found the old foreman with the mine-dust hands standing in the open doorway of a house he had thought he would die far from. He did not recognize her at first. When he did, he asked her, half joking, whether her chronicler's ears had heard what had happened, what had broken the siege, what had sent 40 worlds of enemy running home in a single night. And Issa Tail, who had stood inside the answer, who carried the whole true thing in her like a stone, opened her mouth to tell him. She wanted to. She wanted, more than she had wanted anything in years, to give this man who had kept his grandmother's story the gift of knowing it had been real all along. The truth was right there behind her teeth. She thought of the voice. The doubt is the armor. Help me keep it on. And she understood, standing in that doorway with a man she had nearly robbed of his last comfort a month before, that the foreman did not need to know it was real. He had been right without proof, and being right without proof was the whole of faith, and faith was the thing the dead had built 9,000 years of bedtime stories to protect. If she told him, she would not be giving him anything. She would be taking the story out of the dark and laying it on the table, the way she had spent her whole life doing, and this time she finally saw the cost of it. So she did the new thing, the thing she had learned out there in the cold. She smiled, and she said she had heard the Aubeck supply lines had collapsed, that it was a thing of logistics, a doctrine that overreached. The reasonable explanation, the sober one, the wrong one. The foreman nodded, and looked up at the night sky over Tan's Rest for a moment, and Issa saw that he did not believe her at all, and that he was glad. He let her keep her sensible lie. She let him keep his grandmother's truth. They both, in their way, kept the armor on, and neither of them ever said so. The war was over by the time she finally docked at Meldoran. That was the very first thing she learned, before she had even finished bringing the margin in. The feeds were full of nothing else. The Aubeck cluster had withdrawn from every occupied Korthan system at once, all 22 of them, abandoning their hard-won fortifications and their supply lines and their half-finished conquests, pulling back across their own border with a speed and a totality that none of the analysts could begin to explain. There had been a battle at Hesh. The feeds agreed, though no two accounts agreed on what kind of battle it had been. Some survivors, brought in on small, undamaged ships, spoke in shock of a single gray vessel. Most accounts dismissed those survivors as broken by fear. The official Korthun position, settled within days, was that the sudden Aubeck withdrawal had been the inevitable result of a collapse in their overstretched supply chain, a logistical failure, a crude doctrine of numbers that had finally and predictably overreached its own ability to feed itself. It was a reasonable explanation. It was a careful, sober, sensible explanation. It was exactly the kind of explanation that Issa Tail had built her entire long career on producing. And it was completely, perfectly wrong, and it would stand in the histories of the Reach forever. She went to her desk. The tea she had abandoned 6 weeks ago was still sitting there, long gone cold. A gray skin formed across its surface. Her debunking of the message was still open on the screen, exactly where she had left it, the careful, confident words she had written before any of it began, the words that called the pale verdict a clumsy forgery, and the coordinates certified empty, and the whole legend a thing the Reach told itself so that it could sleep at night. She read it again, line by line. Every line of it was wrong. She had never in her entire life written anything so completely and so confidently wrong. And she knew, with a chronicler's clear, cold certainty, the certainty that had made her name, that if she simply deleted it now and wrote the true thing in its place, the true thing would be filed beside it as the better fiction, and admired and disbelieved, and that this was not a risk or a danger, but a guarantee. She sat with that for a long time. The station was quiet around her. Outside her narrow port, the great libraries of Meldoran turned slowly against the wheeling stars. 9,000 years of stories the Korthun had told themselves across the dark, and somewhere in all those endless careful records, the pale verdict appeared 340 times, and 309 of those times it had been disproven by her own steady hand. She had been so proud of that work, once. She had believed, with her whole heart, that she was killing a legend, doing a service, clearing the dark of one more monster that frightened people for no reason, and got them killed, reaching for saviors that were not coming. She thought then of old Oren Vask in the vaulted debate hall, and of the strange thing he had said as she left. Some stories we tell because they are false, and some because they are true, and we pray they stay told. She had taken him for a frightened old man. She understood now, far too late to tell him, that he had known, not the whole of it perhaps, but the shape of it, the way the eldest of the sept always seemed to know the shape of the oldest things. He had handed her the task not because he wanted the pale verdict disproved, but because the Reach needed someone of unquestioned skill to keep disproving it, to keep the doubt freshly polished, and he had chosen the best doubter alive, and he had hoped, in his careful old way, that she would come back having failed in exactly the manner she had. He had been asking her, that day, whether she truly wanted to disprove it. He had been asking whether she could be trusted to fail well. She had answered with pride, and he had nodded, and let her go, and waited. She understood now that she had been doing the opposite of what she thought. She had been tending it. Every careful debunking she had ever written had been another thin layer of doubt laid down over the truth, another piece of the armor, another year of safe sleep bought for the thing around the nameless star. Her whole proud career had been, without her ever once suspecting it, a long and faithful service to the very legend she had believed she was destroying. The dead had not needed her to believe. They had needed her, and 10,000 chroniclers like her across the ages, to disbelieve, loudly and well, and she had done it better than anyone alive. So she made her choice. It was not the choice the younger Issa would have made, the Issa who had needed the universe to have no holes in it anywhere, who had needed every story to have a small, dull, explainable bottom. It was the choice of someone who had ridden inside the answer and come home, changed in a way she could never undo and could never explain to a single living soul. She wrote the record, all of it. The cold scan that should have been empty vacuum, and the silent 4-kilometer hull, and the open collar waiting in the dark, and the voice in the cold round room, and the 900 sealed throats, and the 11 seconds, and the 4 minutes, and the field of drifting dust where an armada of 90,000 ships had been. She wrote it as truly, and as plainly, and as completely as she had ever written anything in her life, holding nothing back, naming the count and the condition, and the nameless star, and the word on the prow that meant both verdict and last word. She wrote it exactly as it had happened, the way the voice had asked her to, the truest record of her entire long career. And then, at the very top of it, before the first line of the true account, she wrote a single sentence of her own. She wrote, "This is a story I have decided to tell, and you should not believe a word of it." It was the single most honest sentence on the entire document, and it was a lie, and both of those things were completely true at the same time, and Issa Tale smiled for the first time since she had left the nameless star. Because she had finally understood the long, quiet joke the dead had built 9,000 years ago, the joke woven into every bedtime story in the Reach, and she had decided, fully and freely, to be in on it. She filed the record in the open public archive, where anyone in the Reach could find it and read it. She did not hide it in a sealed vault. That was the whole point, the heart of the thing, and she understood it now in a way the voice had not even needed to spell out. She gave the record the plainest, least dramatic title she could think of, and she let it sit there among the other 340 sightings, the finest of them all, the only one ever written by a living witness who had stood inside the answer, and she watched over the following months as her own people did exactly, precisely what the voice in the crystal had promised her they would. They read it. They admired it greatly. They called it her masterwork, the most vivid and most moving myth the Reach had ever produced, a fitting and brilliant capstone to the long career of the great lore master who had come to know the old legend better than any other soul alive. A few of the younger chroniclers asked her, with warm, admiring smiles, how much of the wonderful thing she had invented out of whole cloth. She always gave them the very same answer. All of it, she would say, gently, every single word. And they would nod, deeply satisfied, because that was exactly the answer a sensible and modest chronicler gave about her own finest fiction, and they would go home comforted, and the armor stayed on, and the nameless star stayed empty on every chart, and the gray ship slept. Only once did she ever come close to telling someone the real and dangerous truth. A young chronicler, newly posted to the station, full of the very same bright certainty that Issa herself had carried across the dark at that age, came to her office one evening with her eyes shining. She announced that she intended to mount a proper expedition to the nameless star, to settle the question once and for all, to prove the whole celebrated account a beautiful fabrication, and make her own name doing it. She had the coordinates already, she said proudly. She had taken them straight from Issa's own famous record. She had a fast modern ship lined up, and a wealthy sponsor, and the absolute unshakable confidence of the very young. She wanted only the old lore master's blessing before she went. Issa looked at her for a long, long moment across the quiet office. She saw herself in the young woman so completely that it hurt. The same hunger to open every box and show the dull bones. The same faith that nothing in the dark was worse than the things she already knew. She remembered, with a sudden sharp ache, sitting where this girl now sat, before the high sept, telling 11 frightened elders that the monsters were always smaller than the fear of them. She had been so sure. She had been so wrong and so lucky, and the luck had been the open collar and a thing that chose, for its own ancient reasons, to teach her instead of leave her wondering. She thought about the voice, and the deliberate cold of that hull, and the instruction that the nameless star was not a place for the living to visit twice. She thought about the open docking collar that had been left waiting in the dark for someone who never came, and she wondered, not for the first time, how many had come before her and how many of those the ship had let leave. She thought about telling this bright young woman the truth, the real and whole truth, the one that would either save her life or, far more likely, be laughed off as an old and famous chronicler, jealously guarding her best and final fiction from a rival who might one day claim it. And then Issa Tale did the kindest thing she knew how to do, which was also a lie, which was also a verdict. She told the young chronicler that she herself had quietly checked those very coordinates, years and years ago, long before she ever wrote the famous account, and had found nothing out there but empty vacuum around a dim and lonely little star with no planets and no children and nothing worth the fuel. She told her it would be a tragic waste of a good fast ship, and a generous sponsor, and 2 years of a promising young life. She told her, with the full and considerable weight of her whole reputation behind every word, that the pale verdict was a myth, the oldest and the finest myth the Korthun Reach had ever told itself, and that the single best service any true chronicler could ever do, that great old story, was to love it, and leave it exactly where it lay, and let it sleep. The young woman went away disappointed, and a little crushed, and she did not mount the expedition, and she did not take the fast ship to the nameless star, and so she lived, and grew old herself in time, and never knew how close she had come, or what the old lore master had truly given her that evening. That was the last verdict Issa Tale ever delivered, Not a warship's verdict, written in pale light and cooling dust, but her own, written in a quiet office in 3 soft sentences. To keep the doubt alive, to help the long-dead makers keep the armor on, to let the empty place around the nameless star stay empty on every chart and in every living mind, so that the next proud empire, whenever and wherever it finally rose and grew too proud and forgot the difference, would feed its endless wood to the fire in perfect confidence, certain to the last that there was nothing in the whole dark universe worse than the things it already knew. She lived a long time after that, and grew old and well-respected in the quiet libraries of Meldoran, and she never spoke of any of it again to any living soul. She did, once, near the very end, write a single private line and seal it where only the next loremaster would find it after her death, a line for the one who would inherit the folder of sightings and the duty of disproving them. It said only, "Disprove it well. Disprove it better than I did. The Reach is safest when its best mind is most certain it is a lie." She trusted that whoever read it would not understand it until it was their turn, and that by then they would understand it perfectly. When she finally died, full of years, the younger chroniclers she had trained and shaped filed her great masterwork, that brilliant and beloved final fiction, in the permanent archive of the Reach, where it remains to this day, read and admired and disbelieved by every generation, the truest record ever written about a thing that everyone agrees was only ever a story. And 11 jumps past the last border buoy, in a place the maps still mark as not surveyed and never bother to fill in, around a small dim star, with no name, and no children, and no reason for anyone to go, a 4-kilometer hull of flat gray war metal hangs alone in a gravity well, like a single stone, resting at the bottom of a deep and patient pond. It gives off no power signature, it answers no hail, it carries 900 sealed gun ports cut in perfect rows along both its flanks, and a single carved word on its prow that means both verdict and last word at once, and old healed furrows in its gray from something 9,000 years dead. And deep inside it, in a round and silent room, a knot of blue light turns slowly in clouded crystal, sleeping, patient, counting, waiting, as it has always waited, for an empire to grow too proud. Waiting for the count to pass 100,000. Waiting, as it will wait 100 grandchildren from now, for someone clever and certain and proud to be foolish enough to believe that it was only ever a myth.